Whitney, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today and being willing to share your story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, if I understand right, you are from a church that the full name is called, or this is your background,
Mhm.
General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn. Is that the full name?
It is, yeah.
Okay, well, that's going to be one that most of those who watch and listen have probably never heard of. So, we're going to need a little bit more context of what is this group? Do you have any idea when it started, or what the
Yeah,
history behind it is?
sure. Um, if you ask anybody who goes to that church, they believe that that church literally began as soon as Jesus was crucified and resurrected. But if you Google it, it started approximately somewhere in the 1800s. A settler that was in, I want to say Oklahoma, actually, began a church out there, and then it kind of started growing, and I believe it went from Oklahoma to Indiana, and then from there just kind of grew.
Huh. So, about about how big is the group? Do you have any idea how many churches or people?
Yeah, I think I mean, there's never been an official count of the members.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but however, there's like smaller assemblies, larger assemblies, and they're kind of all over the United States. They're just kind of sprinkled here and there. Some states have more assemblies versus like others. But I would say there's no more than 3,000 people in this group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds familiar. Um, so yeah, I've met a few members. So where I've heard it concentrated is more like Oklahoma and Indiana. Does that sound right? Or are there a few other places that are more hotspots?
Yeah, there's some up in the Washington, Oregon area up there. There's like one in Texas, I believe. I think there's only one. A couple in New Jersey, a couple in Mississippi. Um, I think there's a couple in Kentucky. Let me think. A couple in Idaho and a couple in Colorado. Those are like the main spots that I'm aware that there are
Mm-hmm.
assemblies. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are some of the teachings that would distinguish the Church of the Firstborn from just a mainstream church? So, not like what are all their teachings, but what are the ones that are different?
Sure. So basically, whenever I would meet somebody and they would say, "Oh yeah, so like, what do you believe? Like, what does your church teach?" We would Anybody from that church will basically go into a list of works-based teachings that like were fundamental for this group of people. So, for example, all the people greet with a holy kiss. So that's men and men, women and women, young and old. It does not matter. If you see them out in public, you're supposed to greet with a holy kiss. So that was definitely,
So sorry, holy kiss. So, is that like, okay, so I've
literally
been
the
in Europe.
equivalent.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Like you'd shake hands and you'd go in and greet somebody. Yes,
Okay, so it's kiss on the lips.
it is. Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's a big fundamental one that like I haven't ever seen another church do that.
Now, is that optional? Is it just something
No.
that's
This is something that if you were baptized into that church, like you were supposed to do that. So after you would get baptized, we would have what's called an ordinance supper, which is washing of the feet. So everybody would wash each other's feet. And then after that, we would take communion, but they didn't call it communion. They called it the ordinance supper. And then after the ordinance supper was complete, then everybody would get in a big circle, whoever had attended, and you would literally go through and greet everybody.
which
Like, in,
means kiss everyone.
correct. Yes, yes.
Okay. How
So
about
that one
that?
was a main one. Another main one is they do not believe in going to the doctor for anything. So no wellness. If you had cancer, like nothing. You never went to the doctor. It was, or like even for childbirth. So all the women birthed at home, no prenatal care, no certified midwives or anything like that as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
So did you have any kind of outward standard? Did you ever run into like rules about dress or clothing? What did that look
Sure.
like?
So you would find different branches throughout the churches. Like for example, my husband's family, who I met my husband through this church, and his family was a part of it. His family believed in wearing skirts and no TVs and everything, like no jewelry, nothing like that. My family was considered more liberal in the church. So, I mean, I grew up being allowed to wear jewelry and, shorts and everything. But like when you went to church, you always wore a skirt, you always wore a dress, or women did. If a woman showed up to church in pants, she would usually be asked to leave.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have visitors come to your church?
Very rarely. We
Okay.
didn't usually have anybody that didn't know somebody else. So we wouldn't have just a random person off the street come in and like visit the assembly. It would usually be like someone had invited somebody from like their school or, from work or whatever, and they would come to the church.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And
But you always had to warn them about greeting with a holy kiss, because that's always kind of weird.
for real. Um, what was your worship like?
So they wouldn't call it worship. So we would start church at about 10 or 10:30, depending on the assembly you went to. And there was like a general timeline of how church would go. But some things could be out of order. So we didn't have like a dedicated minister to get up and preach a sermon. Because they did not believe in like making a what's the word I'm looking for? Like making up a sermon prior to church. So they call it Holy Spirit led. So at any given meeting, you could have 3 different preachers get up and teach you 3 different messages.
And it would just be off the top of their head.
Off the top of their head. Yeah.
I could see how that could be problematic.
Yeah, well, and we'd also have like, say for example, you had like my husband's dad preach, and somebody didn't believe the exact same thing as him. This other man might get up after Eli's dad sat down and would contradict him.
Oh, wow.
So we usually had that. But as far as like church starting, they would start with hymns. We only had hymn books. So they would start with a hymn and sing that. And then usually it was like prayers, so anybody could get down and pray. Sometimes there would be one prayer, sometimes there would be 20. We never knew, right? It's whoever feels, the Spirit, and they get down and pray. And then after that, eventually somebody would feel the Spirit to get up and preach a message. If you went like on a Wednesday night service, sometimes there wouldn't be a sermon at all because nobody felt the Spirit to get up and preach. So you'd just sit there and quiet for like 45 minutes.
Wow.
But then usually once church calmed down or like there was nothing else, or I'm sorry, after preaching, then are usually testimonies, which are just random members of the congregation getting up, and the whole point of it was to be able to praise God for something that had happened in your life, right? Mm-hmm. But it usually wasn't like that, so just kind of depended. So like a Wednesday night service would typically last about an hour and a half. On Sundays, it could last anywhere from 2 hours to like 6 hours, depending on what's going on.
Wow. Did you have any? I'm genuinely curious. I know so little about this group, and honestly, when I was trying to research and like find other former members, I could not find anything.
I know. There's nothing.
Maybe there's something, but I could not find it on YouTube, on Google, I'm like, what search terms am I missing? Yeah. It was hard.
Nope, you won't find very much other than usually lawsuits about this church.
I did see 3 of those.
Yes. Yep.
Wow, and they're pretty serious.
Yes, and they're very serious.
All around denying children medical care, unfortunately.
Usually. Yeah, it's usually about that, or um, like usually molestation.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah.
Oh man. Uh, sorry. One more question. This is me curious. But was there any Pentecostal elements to the service? Like, where was the church on like prophecy and speaking in tongues? Did you have any
Yes.
kind of that stuff?
Yes, they definitely did that. That it was just very random when it would happen, but there were people who were considered prophets in the church. Some would speak in tongues and some would not, but usually the tongues sounded. I could probably still mimic them to this day, to be totally honest. It just didn't sound like, I don't know. But they would get up and some people would prophesy to another person. Sometimes they would be in depth, essentially. Like, they actually felt like true prophecies. Like, if you were going to hear prophecy, it would seem like it was legit. But then there's other ones that we kind of called fluff prophecies that pretty much anybody could have received because it was just so generic. So, but yes, they did believe in those.
That's interesting. Was it more dynamic worship, like with raising your voice and running and stuff like the Pentecostals would do, or was it more calm and reserved?
It's very solemn.
Okay.
Yeah. The first time we went to a baptism at our new church after we had left, I was crying because it was like so happy and like people were so excited that these people were getting baptized and everything. Growing up and like at my baptism and my husband's baptism, like when you get baptized, it's almost like a funeral. Like people are weeping and just sad and solemn. So, yeah.
Huh. That's so interesting. You're blowing my mind. But see, why I was thinking like, is this Pentecostally is because I've heard from other members, and you mentioned there's still some like remnants of snake handling, or it's at least it's not condemned.
Yes. They believe in snake handling. They believe in the signs that follow the believers. They definitely believe that spiritual gifts are like alive and well. And like, I remember I got baptized when I was 14 and I received a prophecy from somebody who actually no longer attends that church either. She left. But she prophesied to me that I had, the gift of healing. Yeah. And so what that was and what it's came to in the years, I'm not quite sure. So, but they do believe in that.
That's so interesting to me that having those Pentecostal aspects all the way to snake handling, but then not having like these solemn services. That's mind blown. Okay.
Yeah.
Moving right along. How did the group view the leadership? Like, were you allowed to respectfully disagree? Was it a more healthy, like they're just one of us, or what was like the relationship dynamic with leadership?
So, depending on your assembly, you would have ordained elders or bishops that would essentially oversee the flock. Like I said, since there were so many different preachers getting up and preaching things, you would hear just a wide variety of people's beliefs essentially on certain topics. For the most part, nobody really got talked to unless you preached something that was kind of like, as a whole, the assembly did not believe this. So, for example, there was, let me see, when I would have probably been in my teen years. I don't quite remember. But we had a bishop, an elder, who got up and taught a sermon basically that like going to the doctors is not a sin. And like and this came right after like a whole bunch of babies had died. And so like we had a string of those, and we had like a string of just a couple people had died from like diabetes. So something that could have been taken care of. Man. Yeah,
I have family members with diabetes. That's I didn't even think of that. Oh, that's awful.
Just things like that. But anyways, he got up and he preached his sermon basically saying that it's not a problem to go and that this isn't a lack of faith and like all of this stuff. And the other bishops of our church, because he went to my church, my home assembly, they told him if he preached it again, he was not going to be a bishop any longer at that church.
Mm.
And he did, in fact, get up again and preach something very similar. And they kicked him out of the assembly, essentially, which I still like follow them on Facebook. And they're some of the best people that I've ever known. So,
yeah.
But
well,
yeah.
that was courage on their part to stand up and teach truth.
Yeah.
I mean,
but nobody was going to listen to it. Like in our church, like everybody is so single-minded focused on like, we have to believe this way, because if we don't believe this way, we are going to hell.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, that goes into my next question, which was, how do they view themselves as a group? You know, a healthy church would be like, we're kind of another denomination. We're part of the bigger body of Christ.
Yeah.
And you see other believers as equals who are outside your group, but that's not the understanding I'm getting. So how do they view themselves versus other Christians?
Yeah, they absolutely believe they're the only ones going to heaven. Like, no other church is making it. And so if you leave this group of people, like, everybody believes that you're doomed to hell.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
So, like, even when my husband and I chose to leave, like, his siblings that have now left the church told us, like, after they had left, we were like, so we're just kind of curious, like, what you guys thought of when we left. And they were like, oh, yeah, we thought you were going to hell. And so it's just very interesting hearing people say that actually out loud. Like, we knew they thought it, but just hearing them say it was like, that's what we thought.
Yeah, that's so sad. And then, but I mean, if you're so isolated as a group, you don't even know what the other churches are like. So I'm guessing there's probably misinformation or misunderstanding of even what other Christians are like.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they just don't believe, they believe that other people are following the way of the world.
And so way of the world, would that, when they think of way of the world, are they thinking of like gross immorality that you and I would disagree with? Or they're like, they're the way of the world because they go to the doctor?
Correct. Yes. Or they cut their hair, or they wear jewelry. Like Eli's dad thought, when Eli proposed to me, even though I was allowed to wear jewelry growing up and everything, he proposed to me without a ring, and we got married without rings.
Now, did you get another gift?
No, I got nothing.
Ring?
I got nothing. No.
We at least got Bibles. We got KJV Bibles. And it would be like monogrammed with his first name and our last name.
Yeah.
I might have one of those on the shelf.
Well, and he never, like, I don't know. I thought he was joking because there was no ring or no nothing. Like, I was like,
yeah.
Are you serious? Like, what? But yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, well, with that, I'd love for you to share more of your personal story with what was it like? Sounds like you grew up in this group. What was it like starting out and being involved with them, and what were the signs how did you end up getting out? I guess just share your story.
Sure. So, I did grow up in this. My family has been in this church for probably, I know of at least 4 generations on both sides of my mom and dad's side. But it probably was longer than that if I had to guess. But growing up, we always went on Wednesdays and Sundays. We were always at church. My dad, actually, when I was a baby, he got appendicitis, and he ended up going to the hospital, and people told him he was doomed to hell and everything. But I think that's kind of where my story started, even though I was a little girl, because my dad was never super strict on not going to the doctor, even though we never went. But he didn't want to push his beliefs on us. And so, like, for example, I remember my mom, like, I looked in my mom's, like, their health cabinet, but a health cabinet with, like, cotton balls, Q-tips and stuff like that. But I remember finding a bottle of ibuprofen, and I was like, what? And I remember being, like, 10 years old enough to understand that we didn't do this, right? And asking her, and she was like, oh, that's for your dad. And, like, I had terrible menstrual cycles as a teenager, like to the point I would black out because they were so bad and painful. And I was like, man, if only I could like take something to relieve this. Like, is there, like, they believe that there was glory in pain, essentially. And so that's what I was taught growing up. But I remember being like 13 or 14 years old and asking my dad, I was like, I just don't understand how we are the only people going to heaven. Like, this makes no sense to me. And then, like, I don't know. I just don't understand how everybody else in the world is wrong and we're right because this doesn't feel right. So I remember kind of questioning it from there. But we didn't really learn about Jesus, and we didn't learn about his grace and all of this. It was all like, even when preachers would get up and preach, it was all about a to-do list. And if you don't walk the straight and narrow, then you were going to miss it. And so, like, work harder, do all these things, you know, I don't know. It was very strict in that sense.
Yeah.
But my breaking point was when I was pregnant with my son, my firstborn. I was in labor with him for a really long time, having, you know, a hard time because I was at home, didn't have any prenatal care. Chose a midwife from the church that wasn't certified, and they were like, I mean, your labor doesn't seem like it's progressing or anything like that. So I kind of got scared and went to the hospital and eventually had my son be a cesarean. And when I remember, as I was about to be wheeled back for my C-section, my husband asked his dad to pray for us. Well, he asked all of our families. He went to the waiting room and asked them to pray for us. And his dad looked him in the eyes and said, I'm not going to pray for her in here. God will not hear my prayers. And so just hearing like that kind of negativity and like just how they viewed God in such a small box that he wouldn't hear them in a hospital. Like, it was just kind of mind blowing. But after that happened, we kind of, I feel like shunned is a really strong word because we still went to church and people would talk to us, but we stopped getting invited to people's houses, and people didn't really want to talk to us. So it felt like a form of shunning, but it wasn't like get out. So we decided to move to Texas because there was another assembly up in Denton. And we went there for 3 months, I think. And I looked at my husband, like, we dreaded going to church at this assembly because it was the same junk that we'd grown up around, just different people. And it didn't get better. And so I remember us sitting in the parking lot at, like, I think church there started at 10:30 and it was like 10:45. So we'd already gotten there a little late. And we sat there and I was like, I can't do this anymore. I can't do it. And my husband looked at me and said, I know, but where do we go? Are we going to hell? And so we ended up trying a new church that afternoon, actually, and heard a message about, like, furthering the kingdom and getting more disciples to come in, and, like, we are just trying to, like, be a movement of God. And I remember looking at my husband and being like, we have never heard a message like this. Like, we've been taught to keep our doors shut, and if anybody, like, don't tell people about what we've got because it's casting your pearls before swine and they won't understand, and all of this stuff. Yeah. So, needless to say, we haven't been back since.
I get the feeling that the Church of the Firstborn was not really prone to outreach and evangelism.
No, not at all. During COVID, which we weren't attending at that time, but we were still on all their text and email lists. They would text, so they weren't meeting in person, which kind of actually surprised me because I thought they would just, like, not care or whatever. But they were not meeting, but we got a text message saying, here's the link to our audio version of church. Like, essentially a whole bunch of people would log on and have church, I guess. I don't know. We never logged in, so that's what I'm just kind of assuming it was. But at the bottom of that text said, make sure you do not share this link with anybody else.
That's insane.
Yes.
Wow. No wonder I haven't been able to find their sermons online either.
No, you won't find anything.
Wow. That is okay. So before I ask you more about, the process of disentangling, I'm wondering, what was your view of God in the group while you were still the most involved? How did you view God and what he thought of you?
Yeah. Man, it's just so sad, like, thinking about this now, because it was such a small-minded view of, like, what we've been given. But honestly, like, I always viewed God as this angry God, like, as somebody who, like, it was the hellfire and brimstone, like, that he was gonna come back with a vengeance, and, like, if you were not ready, you were not making it, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts. And, like, I didn't view God as a loving God. I didn't, like, I remember wondering so many times why I couldn't hear his voice. Like, I prayed for so many things and it went unanswered, and was like, maybe God's angry with me. And, like, I remember thinking that even as, a teenager who decided to get baptized and everything in that church. So, yeah, I was very small-minded.
Well, and I was wondering how you view yourself, but that seems like you started to answer it like thinking God was just mad at you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it just felt like you couldn't really do anything right. Like, there was not very much positivity that surrounded this church at all.
Yeah.
So,
What about the gospel and salvation? What was your understanding of that while you were very involved?
yeah. I didn't really read the Bible very much. Like, I tried. So at that church, they only believed in the King James Version. So even as a teenage girl, it's very hard to understand the King James Version, like with all the these and thous and everything like that. So it was hard for me to understand. But I remember this is one of, like, and it's two of their most common, like, phrases or slogans, if you want to call it. But they would preach, and people would tell you, once in grace, like, this was in a derogatory term, okay? They'd be like, oh, that person believes in once in grace, always in grace. And what that basically meant was that you didn't have to do any works. So if you believed in grace like that, then how could you? Because God doesn't give out grace freely. You've messed up. You're a sinner. Like, and all of that stuff.
So grace was kind of bad. It was framed in a negative light.
Correct.
Like, people who believe in grace, it's antinomianism is, I think, the bigger word for it, but they can just sin all they want.
Yes,
that's the people that believe in grace, that greasy grace.
Yeah, so they basically believed if you believed in grace, then you probably also meant you could just sin and do whatever, and it was fine because God gave you grace. So that was always a derogatory term, which is funny because now I'm like, yeah, what's in grace? Always, we are in grace. So, which is really funny now. But, and as far as, like, reading the Bible and stuff, like, I remember preachers telling me as a teenage girl, like, don't study the Bible too much or you'll study yourself out of the faith.
What?
And I was like, and I remember asking my dad about that. I was like, why do they say that? Like, if I study the Bible, I was like, does that mean what we believe is not right? And, like, my dad would not answer me because he, like, I think he was already on the verge of kind of wanting to leave the church. And my mom would not do it. So that's kind of our family dynamic.
Yeah, well, man, the fact that they said it out loud, like, I've heard of so many other groups that they don't want you to study your Bible, or they're caution against it, or they'll, like, downplay Bible study, but the fact that they would actually tell you, don't study the Bible too much, you could study your way out of faith.
I know. Well, I'm like, isn't that what the Bible is here for, to reinforce our faith? Like,
right.
But no, we never heard that. So, it's very interesting.
That's crazy. Well, and they also didn't study for sermons.
No, they didn't study for sermons, and, like, if you got a devotional of any sort, or, like, a journaling Bible or anything like that, those were, like, big no-nos. Like, you did not do that.
So did you have any outside Christian resources?
No.
Wow. And then you don't have your own resources because they don't even record their sermons.
No, they don't do anything. So, like, the most you could potentially do, and even then, like, people would look at you like, what are you doing? Is, like, I would bring a journal, and I might, I think I've thrown them away since, but I used to have journals full of like the sermons and like my notes and what happened and like essentially stuff like that. But I don't think I have them anymore.
Oh
I think I've
man,
thrown
if you
them
ever
all.
find them, they're gold. Like
They probably
contraband.
would be. I'd be like, oh yeah, I forgot about this.
I feel like the church would not want to get that to make it out.
No, they would
Wow.
not.
So secretive. And I'm just thinking about how all those factors, don't study, we don't have resources, don't use anybody else's resources, the preachers shouldn't study, all that combined would just result in the most biblically illiterate
Yes.
congregations.
Yes.
Oh, that's so sad. Okay.
Yeah, like my husband, he would get into, I call them fights, but arguments or whatever with other young boys of the faith, and they'd all be debating about things, but not even really understand it. Like a concept that is such a big concept in Christianity, and we didn't even know about it. And if I were to tell anybody at that church about this, they would literally like say I'm blaspheming. But it's the Trinity. Like,
Wow.
they do not believe in that at all. And, like, that was something that me and my husband had to grow to understand. And even for a while, I understood it. I mean, obviously to the best that I can, because it is mysterious. But my husband thought I was blaspheming for a long time. And this was even after we left the church. And we were talking about it. And I was like, okay, get this concept that most Christians believe. And he was like, no, there's no way I can't even, like, there's no way I can even wrap my mind around it. So, yeah.
Wow. So, one question we hear a lot when we're talking to is the way we were working with Brewing Holiness as a nonprofit, as we're trying to create these faith-based resources, is we'd really love for them to be donor funded and like operate like a charity. For example, a pregnancy resource center, they don't charge the women who are coming in for help. And that's kind of how we'd love our model to be in the future, is to be able to offer resources without charge, hopefully, or very little. So anyways, but that means a lot of fundraising and talking to people and sharing the need and getting Christians excited about raising funds for faith-based resources. But anyways, all that to say, one question that we run into a lot when we're talking to mainstream Christians who aren't familiar with these groups is, if they don't like their church, why can't they just go to another church? But as you and I know, there's a lot more to it. There's a lot of challenges that you face, as anyone would face who's disentangling. What were some of your personal challenges of, you realize you don't want to go back to this group, you're seeing the issues, but then what are you facing as you consider leaving, or as you do leave after the fact?
I think this is like one of the hardest parts, like the biggest pill to swallow whenever you end up leaving one of these churches, is that, like, I didn't realize it was a cult. Like, I didn't realize just what it was because I grew up in it. Like, it was nothing out of the ordinary for me. But when we chose to leave, which I have a funny story about this anyways, but I'll say after this. But when we chose to leave, we knew we were leaving behind our families, because our families, like, once you leave, people are like, well, we have to go to them, and we have, like, people inside the church are saying this about people like me who are leaving. They're like, well, we need to go to them. We need to minister to them. We need to tell them they're going to go to hell if they don't come back, and like all of these things. And what we knew we were going to face is that we would lose our families. They would no longer want to associate with us or talk to us because they truly believe there's no hope for us anymore. And so I'm not going to say that we're like the cousin twice removed, but like, we're no longer invited to like our family's weddings, like my cousin's weddings and Thanksgiving and Christmases. So we're no longer part of that family. And like, not only that, but I lost all my friends that I grew up with. So like, I had a pretty good core group that I grew up with at my home church in Indianapolis. And once we left, like, I'm no longer in contact with any of them. And it's from not lack of me trying, but they just don't understand anymore. They're just like, well, we have nothing in common anymore. And so we lost our support system when we left, and had to pretty much, we also had to figure out who we were, because like growing up, women do not work, they do not go to college, they do not do any of this stuff, and neither do men. Like, they don't go to college either. Like, that was really frowned upon. Yeah.
Missed that one.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. It was very, very much frowned upon to, honestly, for most of the church, it was really frowned upon to go to public school or do anything besides homeschool, because
But
of
then,
what
I'm just thinking about their homeschool. Like, I homeschooled all the way through, and it was great. But if you're going to a church that's, like, no outside resources.
literally, yeah. Well, and they would like read the curriculum and make sure that there wasn't anything that went against our beliefs and stuff, which, shocker, a majority of it is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It was just all of that combined. We just lost our support group, and we had to figure out who we were coming out of this mess.
Yeah, and like you've already shared, you guys, it was drilled in your head that, you know, all the other churches are worldly or backslidden. Did you have any fears around trying a new church?
We did. My husband and I actually made a list that we talked about, and we studied the Bible. And like, I remember the first time I brought home an ESV Bible, my husband, like, it took him a longer time to disentangle, I think, than me, which he's still, trying to do that. But when I first came home with an ESV Bible, he was like, Whitney, what did you do? Like, that was such a bad thing. I was like, I need to understand what I'm reading. Like, I just don't understand it. And he was like, whatever. Like, he just kind of let it be. But yeah, I don't know. It's just, there's so many things like that. But anyways, we created our list of things that we believed as core beliefs from our past church. And the funny part about it is, majority of the things that we had on that list are no longer things that I'm even like, we called them heaven or hell issues at the time. Like, will this get us to heaven? Will this send us to hell? And like, those were the things that we based our views on when trying new churches. But that list is definitely like, it's not even a thing anymore.
So now that you look at it, you see like, oh, that's like secondary, tertiary, or
yes.
Yeah.
Which we didn't know about that type of thing back then, like, because we'd never learned what actual core, like, primary beliefs were. Like, this is what the Christian church believes in. Like, for us, it was, don't go to the doctor, don't cut your hair, be modest, and like all of these things. So
yeah, that was the important part.
Those were the important things. Were just the work things that aren't even important. So.
Wow. So how did you come to find healing from some of this and rebuild? Because it sounds like you were not finding resources. You really had to go out and look and be brave and try a new church, which unfortunately a lot of people don't do. So that's amazing, and I'm so glad that God, in His grace, did give you the courage to step out and try new churches. But what was that experience like of trying to figure out your beliefs, and how did it start? It sounds pretty lonely, but then how did it go from there?
Yeah, so it was very lonely because we were all by ourselves, like trying to figure out who we actually were and what we believed in and everything. I remember stumbling across, because Facebook is always listening to us, so I always get ads that are tailored to me, but I remember an ad popping up for the Daily Grace Co., which is like a women's, they do a bunch of devotionals and Bible studies and just resources for women, and I remember listening to one of their podcasts, and I don't even really remember what it was, but I was like, wow, this is so in-depth, and like, what does this even mean? And like, I remember buying one of their studies, and I was like mind blown. Like, I had to go over it several times because I was like, hang on a sec. Like, I had to just rewrap my mind around it. But I think it was easier for me to rebuild my faith than it's been for my husband, because he was a little bit more entangled in the workspace stuff than I was. But even then, like I had so much rebuilding to do, and I remember being so incredibly bitter with firstborn and being like, they didn't teach us this. This is something that's a salvation issue, not that. Like, and I remember thinking that and being so bitter for a long time. And I just had to pray and like ask God that He would show me things and like help me rebuild in the way that He wanted me to view the world and view His people. And like, I don't know, I think He's always kind of given me a more open mind set to like, I don't know, to just be open to new teachings anyways,
Mm-hmm.
and like be able to discern what feels good in my spirit and what doesn't, and what can I actually read in the Bible versus what I cannot, and like not cherry pick different verses and be like, well, I'm going to read this verse literal and this one not literal. Like the amount of times that I've heard that over the year, like back when I was there, is, well, verse 8 is literal, but verse 9 not literal, don't take that literal. And then you're like, what?
That's confusing.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's now been 5 years since we've left, and like it just feels like a lifetime ago. I mean, I started from ground zero again and just had to rebuild and be like, okay, what do I actually believe about baptism? What do I actually believe about grace? What do I believe about Jesus? Like, we never heard about Jesus growing up. Like hardly ever. Like hardly ever. And it was all about God. And like it reminds me, like now that I've read the Bible through and actually understood, like it just reminds me of the God that people used to see in the Old Testament, like the mean God, like the God that was going to be just and going to, do what He needed to do to like destroy certain groups of people and stuff like that. Like that's just how
That
they
was the focus.
that was the focus.
Wow.
And like I don't know, it's just it's been a journey, and but I'm so thankful where I am now.
How do you view God now after disentangling and learning and growing? How do
Hmm.
you view God now in contrast to back then?
Yeah, like I see God as a God of love, like in the way I'm so thankful that my kids are not growing up how I grew up. Like, sorry, pregnancy hormones. I'm like, oh, but like God is a God of love. He created us in His image. Like if you just boil that down to its basic, like what He did, He wanted community with us. He didn't want to destroy us and like all of these things. And even though we live in a fallen world, that doesn't mean we're a fallen people. Like our job is to still further the kingdom and continue in the way that Jesus set us. Like it's just there's so much more hope now than when I was growing.
Wow. And you've already started to answer, but how do you view the gospel and salvation now in contrast to the works based that you grew up around?
Yeah, the works-based teaching is so damaging because it makes people think, well, if I do this, if I strive, if I complete this to-do list, and your to-do list will never be done. It'll never be done. And if you actually believe that Jesus died for your sins and that He freely gives His grace, then that should change you. Like if you believe in grace, then that makes you want to do the things that God says, yeah, you should do. You should love your neighbor. You should not lie. Like, but it all stems from grace. It doesn't stem from you doing these things and apologizing, but then talking behind people's backs.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a heart posture. So
Yeah, you're no longer pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
bootstraps. Yes.
Just hoping that you make it.
Yeah.
Oh, man, I'm just thinking about how hard it would be. You've been told your whole life that you're doomed if you leave. Did you ever struggle with those fears after you left that maybe they were right and maybe you are doomed?
I think there was a couple of times that popped up, but it was mostly like I remember the church that we attended up in Dallas that they said, here's our 4 core truths. And we actually tell our kids this every night, like these 4 core truths. And it's, I am loved. Jesus has forgiven me. Everything is possible. And there's one more, but I'm like not going to do it. Anyways, they were like, out of these 4 core truths, which one of them is the hardest for you to believe? Like, which one just doesn't sit well with you? And the biggest one for me was that I'm loved. Like,
Wow.
believing that I'm truly loved by my creator. And I was like, well, this is a simple concept and I don't believe it. Like, I'm struggling with it. So, I don't know. Now that we've been away, like, I don't think that anymore. Like, there's no way they're right. There's no way.
Yep.
So, I don't think that anymore.
So, of course, these churches still exist.
Yes.
This group still exists. And I'm wondering, so I'm sure there are, I know it. Like, I know we don't know their names, but I know that there are people who are considering leaving. And they're going to face the very difficult journey that you and your husband have been navigating over the last several years. And when they first get out, they're going to feel, just as lonely as you did. What kind of resources would you love for them to be able to have access to?
Yeah. I was actually talking to my husband about this the other day, and I was like, if we were to leave again, would we have, because we didn't look for resources, because we thought we were the only ones out there leaving something like this, to be totally honest, because we'd never explored other churches, had never learned about different religions, like none of that stuff. And so I was like, would you have looked for these resources even if we were to do this all over again? And he's like, no, because we just didn't know they existed. We didn't know to search for them. We didn't, nobody went to therapy.
You said you wouldn't know to look for the resources, so that kind of means that those of us who are trying to create, support systems and bring together community, it also is on us to find them in some sense. And what I'm thinking of when I say that is like social media and web search, and this kind of thing to make sure that we're able to reach, if they're Googling like people who have left Church of the Firstborn right now, they're not going to find like anything.
They will find nothing.
Yeah.
And I don't think they would realize that there are resources for them out there, because they wouldn't even, I never searched anything up until a year ago, my husband and I went and talked to our pastor because we were having some problems and everything. And we were telling him our backstory and everything like this. And he stopped my husband in the middle of a sentence. He was like, just so you know, you should stop referring to that church as a church. That is a cult. And I was like, what? And that was up until a year ago. So I never would have searched when leaving a cult. When I thought of cult, I was thinking of the Amish and didn't associate myself with those type of people. But now the longer that I've been away, the more I'm like, oh yeah, it is a cult. You're taught not to question things. You're supposed to follow your leaders and all of this stuff. So I think that's the hardest part. What helped me was being able to find things that made me question my faith deeper. But that's also my personality, is I like more information like that, and where I can make my own decision based off of what I'm reading. So I don't know.
When did you come across Bree and Holiness?
I think it was from my sister-in-law. I think she had met you and then told me about it and was like, hey, you have to read this. And I was like, oh my, okay, hang on.
So, of course, we're not, tailored towards Church of the Firstborn at all. At least we weren't. I'd love to make new resources that are, but in the past we haven't been, because it was like, what's that?
What is that? Yeah.
So what did it feel like? So you're at that point, you'd already been out for years, but what did it feel like seeing seeing a platform with similarities.
Similarities. I don't know, it's almost like deja vu, because I think my mind sometimes once, like, it just feels like that was a lifetime ago, even though it was 5 years ago. And I think it's because I've come so far, and I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago trying to leave that church, because I mean, that was a pivotal moment in my family's life. Like, my kids know who Jesus is, and they willingly and always want to pray and talk about Jesus and talk about, living in the light and everything like that. And I never did that as a kid. We were never taught anything, or to pray, or, anything like that. So I guess seeing this stuff was kind of like a jolt. And like, even though it wasn't exactly like how I grew up, there were so many similarities that was like, maybe I'm not healed, because it brought up a trigger inside. And I was like, okay, hang on. Maybe I need to get more into this, like figure out more healing. Like, I don't know. I don't know that we'll ever just heal from leaving, but I'm so much further now than where I was. So, and that's God's grace to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. But those similarities, sometimes we hear people say like, oh, it's validating, almost like I'm not the only one that's struggled in this way. But I'm also wondering about, okay, so more people are leaving Church of the Firstborn. How are we going to make sure they get the biblical gospel? Do you ever, and of course they may not know to look for resources, but I'm kind of concerned because there's so many anti-Christian resources that give so much sympathy for people who have had religious like trauma or spiritual abuse or cultish backgrounds, but then they're anti-Christian, so they're also saying, and Jesus isn't God, and against Christian values. Have you ever run into that, or do you have any concerns that people who leave the Church of the Firstborn might just leave faith entirely?
Yeah, this one's such a hard one, because I have a family member, they got so bitter while still attending the church, and they would get like prophecies telling them that what they did was so wrong, and like just condemning their behavior and everything of going to the hospital for their son. And like to the point where they've left the faith completely, like entirely. And I knew I didn't want to be like that when we decided to leave, because I was like, God has been so good to us. I can't just say there's not a God. Like, even though these people have hurt us, and I don't think they know what they're doing, to be frank. But with all that being said, like, I knew of a lot of people that had, I'm not going to say a lot, I would say probably 20 to 30 people that I personally knew that had left the church. And out of all of them, less than 10 had decided to find a new church. The rest of them just fell away and just started living more like a rambunctious lifestyle, I guess. Like, because they felt like they were so deprived in the church that they just decided to go on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. But yes, in short, I guess in long, I do think that the resources that are out there, like, I have seen them, and they are damaging, because they aren't pointing people to the truth. And unfortunately, they're preying on the people who are already hurt and telling them that, well, those people, they hurt you, and it's valid. Like, it's like validating their feelings instead of being like, well, yes, those people might have hurt you. That wasn't God, right? And that's how simple it is to sway somebody one way to the other, like one way versus another. So yeah, the other research, I have seen the other ones, and they're not beneficial. And I actually did get targeted with those kinds of things, like, pretty soon after we had left. And I was like, no, this isn't for me. But I was also rooted and grounded and knew that people had hurt me, but that wasn't God. So.
Right. Yeah. So I'll make this our last question. So now, as far as we know, this is the first conversation of someone who's left Church of the Firstborn that's going to be findable online.
Lovely. That means
Yeah,
the
right?
2,000 people that I know are going to be like, we know her.
Oh my. Yeah, okay. So, but with that being said, if someone who is considering leaving Google's, Church of the Firstborn, someone who left, this is going to pop up. So what, on the last question would be, what would you want to tell them? What would you like to say to that Church of the Firstborn member who is struggling and considering leaving, and all the worries about God being angry and the work salvation and being doomed if they leave, all that's in their head? What would you like to say to them?
That God is so much bigger and better than what we know of him. Because back then, my view of God and the world and salvation was so small. But breaking free from Church of the Firstborn has been the best decision that I have ever made in my life. Like, my life is on a completely different trajectory now than what it would have been 5 years ago. And like, getting to raise my kids in biblical truth and knowledge that God and Jesus love them, and that like grace is for you. You are loved. Like, your sins have been forgiven. They aren't going to follow you. And like, I don't know. It's just getting to pull away from that church. Life is so much better. Like, you don't have to constantly be looking over your shoulder wondering if God is going to strike lightning from the sky and kill you. Like, I think that's what some people literally think, and he's not like that. There is so much more to God than just trying to do works and do it of yourself.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I enjoyed it too. I haven't revisited this in a long time. But yeah, it's been, I mean, while it is a difficult conversation to take, like, to go over and everything, like, I know it's needed.